Hey, y'all. Welcome back to another episode of Tech Backstage. My name is Eddie Hudson here with our guest, Shahid Jivani from Logic Board. How you doing, Shahid?
Doing good, good. How about you, Eddie?
I'm doing good, man. Thanks for asking. Thanks for taking the time to be on the show today. I'm looking forward to the discussion. It's definitely something that I'm passionate about, and looking forward to diving into it. But before we get started, I'd love to talk a little bit about you and hear a little bit about, your background, your origin story, and, how you got into, tech in the first place.
Yeah, so I guess like going all the way back, I started coding when I was in elementary school. Played this game called RuneScape, pretty popular. It's coded in Java. Then as a kid, I kind of got really curious. I was always a tinkerer, and so I kind of figured out how like the code worked and started, making like mods and working on like little things for that. And eventually got into coding from there. And then, just kind of pursuing CS was something I started in high school right after that. So like starting off my freshman year all the way throughout, and then got an undergrad degree in computer science, and then jumped right into the industry. Um, my first job, I was kind of like a solo engineer on this like application. It was like for an oil and gas company, and so I got like, a pretty wide experience of the entire stack of development. And I was always like kind of unsure of where to focus and kind of like what that meant between like front end, full stack, back end, and all those things. And I always got kind of asked during interviews of like, hey, like what kind of engineer are you? And I never really had a good answer. And so I figured, it's a good kind of conversation to have to, give people some context of like, as they're growing in their career, like where they should be focusing on. And then for myself, I really like the full stack piece of it. I like kind of creating the entire application from back end to front end. And then that kind of gave me an idea of, what business problem we're trying to solve. And that kind of, and I also really just like working with people. My career choice before I got into like the corporate world was I actually wanted to teach computer science. And so people management was like a close-ish kind of thing where I can kind of, have a group of people where I'm kind of showing them what we're trying to build, kind of create a vision, and making sure we're working on that, and help support the team and making sure they have their growth in their career. And to me, like it fit in really well with like that passion. But then also like tech, I think, is a very interesting piece. Like we have the tools pretty much to build so many like already we've built like platforms where we can communicate, where we can collaborate and all that. And I think there's like a lot more things to build. So being able to work with both of those was a pretty exciting thing. And so that's kind of what led me to becoming a engineering manager now.
Cool. And so you went to, I believe, UT originally, right?
That's right. Yeah. UT Austin.
Cool. Tell me a little bit about your journey from UT Austin to where you're at now at Logic Board.
Yeah. So postgraduate, I worked at that oil and gas company. So it was not a SaaS company. So we essentially built in-house applications. And so it was pretty cool kind of like working with your customers directly, just because like they were kind of just upstairs. And so they'd kind of tell you what they needed for their day-to-day job, kind of go back into my office, build it, go back up to them, get some like testing done, validation of like, hey, does this actually fit like your workflow? And then that kind of gave me a lot of like experience kind of understanding what business problems they're trying to solve, because usually it was a conversation with them too of like, I need to track this metric for my job. And so then I would have to work with the data person to kind of figure out how we can display that metric in a way for them that is helpful for them to do their job. And so, and then it was a lot of the front end and the back end there. And so I did that for a few years, and I kind of decided that I wanted to work somewhere that was a SaaS company, because, it felt like as I was kind of talking to the same people, trying to figure out what they need, it would be cool to see like a wide group of people and like work somewhere where we're building something that kind of like we're selling to, everybody. And so that's what kind of took me to Autodesk from there. I used Autodesk growing up, so it was like a exciting place to go between like AutoCAD and, a lot of those 3D modeling softwares. And then I had some experience with like, seeing Maya used around in like movies, so it seemed like a cool place to work. And then so I joined there as a software engineer. I did that for a few years, and towards the end of like my like software engineering like IC phase, I got to be a tech lead. And so for a project, and I really enjoyed kind of working with my team, kind of creating the high level definitions for that project, and that kind of led me to the people management role. And I've been doing that since and enjoying that. And I guess like since after that, I guess for my current role, what kind of led me there too was since I did start off as that engineer and a kind of tech leady position, that kind of led me to the management in that same team. it was kind of hard to get myself away from the code just because a lot of things that like, I had a lot of that knowledge. And so I kind of wanted to go somewhere that was quickly like moving like a startup and somewhere where I could kind of jump in with like a fresh start of like, okay, let me focus on the organization, figure out processes that make sense and not kind of get pulled off to do like the day-to-day code and like, solving tickets just because I was the SME in that area. And so
Right.
that's kind of what led me here. And, I do feel like tech is like something that is constantly like evolving and there's a lot of problems we haven't solved yet. Because like if you think about it with machine learning and AI like nowadays, like you can essentially solve a lot of problems that we don't have solutions for yet. Because really many things can be possible, right? Like
Yeah.
even something simple like predicting what you might like, when you have like Spotify and like music things, like they kind of predict like what songs you might want to hear based on what you've already heard, and just by like ingesting a lot of data. And we can do that for a lot of different things. It's just that we have the tools to do them, but it takes an engineering effort and someone to solve that business problem. And so I wanted to go somewhere that was kind of like that, where there was a very strong business case, but there wasn't really quite a tool yet to solve it, which was what kind of led me to Logic Sport, just because they're solving a lot of problems that exist within the freight forwarding industry that haven't yet really been solved.
That's cool, man. I love that. And I love your background too, because I kind of got into coding the same way you did. Is we act a little bit different. Like we were always into video games, but me and my buddies in high school, we used to always code games into our TI-83 calculators.
Oh
But
yeah.
I didn't actually know that that was like a career choice that you could make at that time. I just thought it was something you did for fun. So we used to, build websites on like GeoCities and just really terrible HTML sites. And,
Yeah, the old
up,
MySpace days.
yeah. And I'm probably dating myself, but like even way before MySpace, like back, we were like, this is like the AOL days. So like, a while ago, like late 90s. But no, I love that, it's always that fascination that gets you into tech, I think, right? Like you're always interested in how things work and you always want to pull them apart and figure out how to put it back together, right? And that's kind of how I got into it as well. But it's great to hear a little bit about how your backstory and how you got into Logic Board. And I even like the journey from being a developer into now an engineering manager, which is I think something we want to circle back to in a few minutes as we start discussing the topic, which is finding your niche in the tech industry. For me, this is near and dear to my heart because I actually started out going to college as an electrical engineer and living in Austin, I was an audio engineer but had always done web dev on the side. um, but as kind of a self-taught engineer, I was always trying to figure out what I wanted to do with my life. And I always liked software. I didn't know how to get into it really. But coming from an unconventional background, this is something that for me definitely it took me a little bit of time to figure out. Would love to hear a little bit about your journey as you uh, you know, going through your CS major at UT. What were some of the first challenges that you had, coming out of a CS program and coming into the industry, fresh? Like, what were some of the things that you were dealing with at the time? And, what were some of the challenges that you had to overcome?
Yeah, I felt like the biggest like shock to me was just like how different the day to day was as a student, like the work that you did versus like what you do at your job.
Yeah.
I mean, like, you take classes on algorithms, you create an algorithm that works in, big, like whatever efficiency that fastest that you can make it. But when you're actually like working on something, yes, you have to consider that stuff, but there's a lot more nuance to it of just like,
Yeah.
you're not really given and exactly like build this. You have this like problem space that you're trying to kind of solve for, usually of like, business case. And then you're trying to find the best solution for that business case, which does take that into account. But there's also just so much more that goes into that. And then I think the other big piece was like you as a student, you are kind of usually writing your own code. You started from kind of from scratch. You have a project that you're building up, but then when you join a company, you have this like giant source code that many other people have already contributed to, and you have to kind of understand that and how your part that you're building for the problem that you're trying to solve is going to play in that like giant set of code that is already there. And not only that, but you can't break that. Like people are using
Right.
that, so you have to like be wary of that as well. So there's a lot I think to kind of navigate as you jump into that.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. And I think one of the things too that I would, especially coming into the industry, is that, and you'll look at it nowadays, is, obviously a CS degree is super important, but it's not nearly as important as actually being able to, develop programs and work with other people. But I think one of the things that I've heard the most, and I don't know if you agree with this, but would love to hear your opinion on it, is that, I think a CS degree is great for teaching you the theory, but it's not necessarily great for teaching you the practical day to day, you know, knowledge that you need in order to be successful in the industry. I don't know, what are your thoughts on that?
Oh yeah, no, I would definitely agree. I've kind of also heard the phrase that like a degree just kind of shows somebody that you can learn just because that's what you do when you're in university, right? You kind of have
Yeah.
this piece of paper showing that you can understand concepts, apply them, and like you've been tested on it, and all that. A CS degree specifically is like, you can understand CS concepts, you can apply them, and you've got like some understanding of them. But then I think when you do enter the industry, you have, I think, so much to learn of just like the specific frameworks because I think a lot of schools, I'm assuming, still do like C, or C or like C++, Java, a lot of those languages. And when you kind of get to the industry, most of them are using like TypeScript and a lot of these newer like
Right.
languages. And so there's a lot of learning there to just like even start off with of how to use this language you've never really even tried using, maybe except for maybe personal projects, but not
Yeah.
necessarily even for your degree.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think that degree just kind of shows that you can learn. And I've seen a lot of like, great engineers come out of like boot camps or being self taught just because, yeah, that ability to problem solve and that drive to do it is really, I think, what kind of makes or breaks you.
Yeah, I agree. And I think the other thing too, and I think this is, this lends really well to the topic, but I think one thing that's not discussed a lot nowadays are all of the different roles that are available in the industry right now. And I don't think anybody's ever like, again, when you're going through a CS or a traditional degree program, I feel like they don't necessarily highlight all of those different things. Like what does a front end engineer do? What does a back end engineer do? And I mean, obviously, at a high level, yes, maybe they do, but do you really sit down and spend time exploring those concepts at UT, or are you guys mostly focused on, just learning the theory? And I mean, how much exposure did you have to all of the various roles, and even like the different colors of the different roles that were out there in the industry?
Yeah, I really don't think they cover a lot of that in school, which is why I think it's like a very important thing to kind of talk about. Just because I know for myself, I had no idea what I wanted to do after kind of college. Like, I think it was a conversation that students had with each other of just like, hey, like, where are you trying to focus? But it was really just kind of like go figure it on your own. And then, if you have friends, you can talk about it with them. But there was not really much guidance, I would say, just throughout the degree of like, this is what you should focus on for this. Like, there are electives, but like, with a lot of schools, I think they're hard to get into like your top choice. So you end up taking a big variety of just electives, kind of like you get maybe your first pick, but then after that, it's like
Yeah.
whatever is available. And I think everything else is just like high level like theory of like data structures and algorithms, basic like coding fundamentals and things. And so I do think you're kind of left to your own devices to kind of figure that out as you're in the industry. And I think
Yeah.
even as we go further than that, like I personally like had no idea what like, a site reliability engineer was. And I thought first time I heard
Right.
that, I was like, no, like I'm not applying for that. I'm applying for software engineer. And like, no, like that is a software engineer. And it was a little embarrassing having that conversation with the recruiter, but I learned. But it would have been good to kind of have an understanding of what that meant before really trying to start looking into the job market.
Right. Yeah. And I totally agree. That's so great. Cyber liability engineer. And you're like looking down the list of jobs that are on the careers page, and you're like, well, I don't check any of these boxes. Like I've never done cyber liability before. And, then like, they're like, oh, it's just a software engineer who, like, oh, okay, I might be able to do that. Right. But it's so intimidating the first time you're actually going and looking for a job, because there's all of these different job titles, and you're like, well, I'm a software engineer. Let's see if they have any software engineer jobs. Right. Uh,
Mhm.
Talk to us a little bit about how, coming out of college, how did you finally decide, like, where you wanted to land? I mean, I know you've told me that, you really enjoy full stack, but I have to imagine you started at least on one side or the other as kind of a primary discipline. But how did you kind of navigate those waters and get to where you really found, your niche and your passion in the industry?
Yeah, I actually do feel like I started kind of on both ends. So like my first job kind of got thrown into an application. I was kind of handed it off from another engineer, and they're just like, "Yeah, this entire thing is yours now. Go help the product people figure out what they need built." And so it was both full stack. It was a like old school WPF application, so it was in C sharp. It was like a Windows application, and so there was like some API calls. It wasn't like very like, compared to what we do nowadays, I think it was a little bit different the way that it was architected, but it was a little bit full stack. And for me, what I realized that I enjoyed the most was really like talking to the other people within the team, like not the engine, like I didn't have the engineers I was working with, but like the business analysts, the product managers, and kind of like understanding how they were using the application. And that gave me a lot of like, ideas of like what to kind of build, because we didn't really have a lot of guidance. I do also think just like, your first job kind of shapes you potentially if you don't have a lot of like input on what you're doing, just because like that's kind of what you're getting thrown into. You'll probably figure it out, and that's kind of going to shape the rest of your career, just because that is your first experience into like, this engineering world.
Yeah.
And so for me personally, like I just had a whole application. I had a few people to like contact. And I was like, working with a lot of just different executives at the company and things, because it was like a file management system just for the whole organization. And then they had like a lot of requirements of just like, oh, like if we're working on an old contract and that actually costs us millions of dollars, because then like, that's not contractually accurate anymore. And so that was like a big, thing to kind of solve for as I was building out the solution for this application, of just like, this is the problem that they have. How can I solve this problem? And so that's what, I feel like with full stack, you kind of owning both the front end of like the user experience and also like the logic behind it, you do get to focus on like what the overall problem is. And so that for me is what I really enjoyed. And that's what kind of kept me in that like full stack path of like, I would like to have the tools to solve the whole problem, not just like, trying to get the data out as fast as I can, or not build a beautiful UI, which are both like, fun things to do. And, great if you can be good at those things, but kind of like I said, finding your niche, like you really have to find what you're passionate about. For me personally, it was just like solving business cases and just like being able to like understand the nuances of it and build a solution that kind of fit the whole criteria.
Yeah, no, I agree, and I love that too. It's I started out as a front end engineer, but one of the things I'm sure I'm gonna make like like 1,000 back end engineer enemies right now, but like one of the things that I always wished as a front end engineer before I started doing more full stack stuff was I was like, man, I wish they would update the way the shape of this API, because you'd like give them, or at least in my particular case, I'd give them feedback, or I'd give them some Swagger documentation. I was like, it should look like this, I think, on the front end, and they'd kind of like look at me like, stupid front end guy. But like, no, we're just going to build it the way we want to do it. But I love the idea of full stack, because I'm the same way. As like once I started getting into doing more database design and actually building the business logic and the API layer, you can really kind of see the whole thing come together, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then from there, man, I fell down a rabbit hole, because once I started getting into more back end stuff, then I started realizing, oh, now there's also the underlying infrastructure, right? There's the cloud services. And like when I was first doing applications, I was spinning it up on like a VM and wherever, DigitalOcean or something, and it would just live there. But then all of a sudden there's all this cloud infrastructure and AWS services, and you could do a solutions architect certification, or you could do a DevOps certification. And so it's just this like rabbit hole of never ending learning that I just kind of started to fall down from. And it all started from like just being a front end engineer, wanting to build better API layers, and then wanting to go from API layers to understanding, better database designs. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, what's the underlying architecture? But there's so many different roles that somebody could potentially have, or like you said, you could be a full stack and you could actually understand how all of that goes together. I think nowadays, I mean, I think the segmentation used to be a lot more prevalent. You know what I mean? Like, oh, there's back end engineers, there's front end engineers. I'm seeing a lot more people nowadays be able to kind of do at least a little bit of um, everything, right? Because I think it's really, especially like DevOps is a good example that I always use, right? Like, I don't know how to deploy a project without CI/CD anymore, because it's just kind of like one of those things that's ingrained in my head. Like, oh yeah, I should push the master branch and it should be ready to auto deploy when I hit the button, right? So, but I mean, is that something that you experience too? Is that just people having a lot more general knowledge of the entire ecosystem and how an app goes together? Or are you still seeing more segmented like specialty engineers kind of working front end, back end, cloud, DevOps, things like that?
I would say it's probably about half and half still for me. Just because I do think like you were saying, there's a lot of because languages are a little bit simpler now. Like you don't have to kind of deep dive into like comparing like C to TypeScript. Like it's a lot easier to get a lot of code out TypeScript, and like you can use that for the front end and the back end versus like C. It takes a lot of time. You have to understand the nuances of the language a lot just to kind of get something. And I think that enables someone to pick up something and be a full stack developer.
Hmm.
But I still do think like, we're human beings, right? Like we can't ingest every piece of information and be perfect at every little thing. Like there is a lot of
Yeah.
value in being like great at something versus being like a jack of all trades.
Yeah. No,
And
I
so
agree.
And so I think part of that, like, I still know a lot of people who just like love like creating a beautiful user experience. They make the best UI engineers, right? Like or front end engineers, just because that's just what they're passionate about. They like that. And like, being full stack, I can put the buttons on, I can make it make sense, but it's not going to be the same as someone who's just like really into creating like a beautiful user experience. Kind of like you were saying with when you were front end and you were working with the back end people, you're like, why are they making the data like this? I want to like this. But when you're in the back end, you can kind of understand like, oh, like the database is kind of, these are the primary keys, these are the relations. So that's why this payload that they're sending you through the API call is shaped this way. But you don't really quite understand the nuances of why it's built until you're in that field. And even as a full stack person, you might not spend as much time or like have the knowledge to like architect that system in a way that it performs as quickly as someone who has been in that system and like is focused on only that. And so I do think there's like still a lot of people that I know that are kind of focused on, just building out a beautiful UI or just like creating a data model that, makes a lot of sense, is really fast and performant and, just focusing on purely that. But then, yeah, I think that we are also enabled to kind of we also have the tools now where we don't have to worry about deployments like we were saying too. We usually have DevOps people can do that. So it does make it so you can kind of focus on the full stack and not worry about as many things as we used to. So I think that kind of also enables a lot. And I think the other piece of it is also like, because there's so many different industries nowadays, there's a lot of value in understanding the product piece of it, right? And as a full stack person too, I think there's a lot more space to kind of understand that. So I think that's a little bit of a push to a little like people being a little bit less specialized because they do want to understand the problem that they're trying to solve. And that can also make you a better engineer in a way, even though you're not necessarily like, engineering like fundamentals might not be there, but like if you understand the problem you're trying to solve, you'll probably craft a better solution too.
Yeah, I agree. I think the product argument that you just made is super important nowadays because um anytime you're talking about building a good product, you have to understand, the user journeys, and you have to understand how a user gets from point A to point B and how they ultimately solve the problem or actually get to doing the action that you want them to ultimately do. And without that, you're just, like you said, putting buttons on a screen, and you just end up in a infinite click loop. So I think the product argument's really important. I think it's all important to highlight too. It's like not everybody in the tech industry has to be an engineer, or there's tons of roles out there that are super important to building great products, and product owners, product managers, project managers, there's UI UX designers, there's QA engineers, and the list can go on and on, data scientists, data analysts, DevOps engineers. um so I think it's important for anybody listening in right now that to understand that, like, take some time, go out and actually research all the different roles that are available, find one that fits what you're trying to do, right? Because there are a ton of roles out there to build great products. And I think it's important to understand, like, finding something that you enjoy doing and that you're good at, and not trying to force yourself into something that ultimately might not be a good fit for you, right? And with that, I wanted to shift a little bit. I want to talk about, just really quickly, your transition from software engineer into people management, and becoming an engineering manager. What was the point where you were like, what, I love being an engineer, but I think moving into a leadership role is something that I'd like to do? How did you kind of come to that understanding and ultimately move into that role?
Yeah, it was honestly a pretty long process. So like for a while, even as a manager, I wasn't even sure that that's what I wanted to stay on and commit to. So even as like my first few weeks, I was kind of like hesitant because I think something with managing is like it's a lot more ambiguous. Like you don't have tasks that you're kind of moving from in progress, verify, done, and like that you have as an engineer, it's very like you're getting your stuff done. It makes a lot of sense, but there's a lot less like feedback in that sense as a manager. You're just kind of managing your team, and when you deliver a project as a team, then that feels great. But a lot of the time, you're just kind of like making sure things are just kind of going. Um, And I would say like I was kind of back and forth because I still do really like writing code, and I did enjoy the people part of it and like the actual managing. But for me, I remember there was like one specific moment that made me realize that okay, I think people management is like the path I want to stick down, and it was this coaching class that I was taking as a manager where, they were kind of giving us advice on how to coach people on our team to kind of get them to build, be the best versions of themselves and all that. And a question, so we essentially did the same exercises in that course that we would do with our team. And one of the exercises that we did was to kind of imagine yourself, like, in the best case scenario in the path that you're headed down right now. And so I really use that to kind of decide if I wanted to stick to people management or go back to being an IC, because I know a lot of people do go back and forth. So try to think of myself like, would I, obviously best case scenarios, like would I want to be remembered as like someone who was, crafting the best solutions, like as an engineer, like, who was solving the hardest problems and, building the best like systems and all that. But, that sounded great. But then when I thought about the people management side, or like, do I want to be remembered as someone who like, gave people like, the best job satisfaction they had, who led them to like, build like a great product and like kind of gave them that sense. And that one was really the one that kind of, made me a little bit more excited, a lot more excited. And so that's when I kind of decided that like, I wanted to stick to that. Cause like for me, that was felt a lot more fulfilling, is just like having the role where, I can lead a team to build, a great product felt just a lot more satisfying than for myself, like being able to just write the best code or something like that.
Yeah. No, I love that. I think that's great. Man, this flew by, dude. We got like 3 minutes left, and then we're off to the races. So I guess one of the last things I wanted to just chat with you about is, for anybody listening in or who's going to listen to this in the future, what advice do you have to people looking to get into the industry right now? Looking to find their niche and understanding, where they fit into the larger puzzle of the industry. Like what's the advice that you wish you had when you had first started out?
I would say just like understanding what it is about software that kind of gets you excited. Like, I think for me, like I am not the most visual person, so like, even if something's like clunky, I'll use it. It doesn't bother me. I knew like front end was like not the place for me to be, just because like that's
Right.
just not something that like I have an eye for. But like I said, for me, like I could tell that I just like solving problems, like even outside of software. Like I'm the kind of person who like if I see something wrong, like I just want to fix it. And so it made sense for me to kind of get as much of that as I could. So like for me, that meant people management, just because I didn't have to spend as much time in the code itself. I could like spend time with product, trying to understand like what the big problem was that we were trying to solve, communicate that to my team, and make sure that like, we're building the right solution for that problem. And so I would kind of recommend the same thing for other people who are going into the industry, is just like really figure out like what you like to do outside of even like, your job, and just find something that you can, do that with. And so whether that you like creating something beautiful, then I think UI, you know, there's a lot of like satisfaction if you do take satisfaction out of just like seeing something that flows very elegantly. If you just write like like writing clean code and like fast and performant, I think backend makes a lot of sense. And then even the DevOps side, like I have a lot like some of the best SREs that I know are just like, yeah, I just like to have like, make it so that engineers can work as quickly as possible and like remove as many blockers for them as I can. And they make, I think, the best like DevOps or SREs, because like they're just so focused on like, how can I deploy this as quickly as I can so engineers can like test the work as fast as I can, and all of that.
Yep.
And even with QA, it's people who are, they just have an eye for consistency, and they just like things like, to be repeatable and all that. They usually have those traits, and they make for the best QA engineers. And so just like understanding yourself, I think, is a big part of kind of finding that niche too.
Yeah, I love that. And I actually I have a really good buddy who's like a really killer QA engineer, but I always told him before he got into the industry, I was like, dude, you're really good at breaking stuff. You should try being a QA engineer.
That too.
And
Yeah.
turns out he actually really likes it. So last question in regards to this, for anybody looking to get into the industry and looking for their first job, uh what recommendations do you have about meeting other people in the industry, or applying to that first job and trying to stand out against potentially other candidates, especially considering you're an engineering manager? I'm sure you see a lot of CVs, and would love to hear a little bit about what are the things that stand out to you when you're looking at people that are applying to the open positions that you guys have.
Yeah, I feel like So when it comes to CVs, I usually will look at for like bullet points and kind of see how they talk about their work. Someone just like writes a point of like made a good UI or wrote backend transactions. Like that doesn't mean a lot to me. Like I think everyone's doing that, but someone who can really articulate like what they're doing there of like, oh, I improve the performance here by X percentage by changing this module, or I can really show me that they know what they're doing and why they're doing it. I think that stands out. And then that kind of, I would say, like the point of the resume is usually just to lead to an interview. Like I don't think anyone gets hired purely on the resume. Like if you have a bad interview, then you're probably not going to get hired. The resume is really just to get your foot in the door. And then I think once you have that interview, it is really just like being able to advertise yourself and kind of continuing to have that passion and that that you and being able to articulate like what you have done, and showing that you would be someone that would be valuable there. Like as a manager, like I want to have like someone that my team can rely on and that I can rely on. And so being able to talk to someone that knows what they're doing and seems like the kind of person who would be excited about their work, who would be in like a culture add to my team as well, just like this is someone that's excited, brings that energy, and can get their work done. Like usually that's what I'm looking for in the interview too.
Very cool. Yeah, and I always appreciate people that are authentic. They're not afraid to be themselves, and willing to kind of show that that original side that they have. That's always something I'm looking for as well, just as kind of like a extra bullet point to what you said, because I think a lot of that was great advice. But wow, yeah, we're over 30 minutes. So Shahid, thanks so much for being here. And I feel like this is one of those topics we could have been talking on for at least an hour. There's so much stuff to cover, but I appreciate you giving us a little bit of insight into your journey, how you found your niche in the tech industry, and then also giving us some advice to some of the listeners that might be looking for their first job as well. So appreciate you being here. Carlos, do you want to come in and just give us a quick update on the rest of the shows that we got coming up this week? You're on mute, by the way, buddy.
I apologize. Always happens to me. That's my trademark.
Yeah.
I apologize.
Yeah.
Okay. So yes, Eddie. Well, we still have a very busy week ahead. The remainder of it, albeit, and so we got on Wednesday. We're going to be speaking with Nadia Adams from Blue Agilis. Then on Thursday, we'll be speaking with Chris LaFarley from Tatum. And finally, on Friday, we'll be talking to Anand Diraviam from Airs. So that's what we have right here on Tech Backstage. So join us Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday at 11 o'clock in the morning, Pacific time. Remember, mark your calendars, don't miss it, and be here. Thank you.
Thanks, Carlos. And Shahid, thanks for being here. We'll see you soon.
It was fun. I appreciate you having me.
Yeah.
Bye.
Have a good day.